What I'd like to talk to you about today is that good researchers and presenters can use that rhetorical triangle to ensure that the information that they've kind of captured and collected is likely to persuade their targeted audience. That rhetorical triangle, again, remember, is ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos, your credibility as a speaker, writer, and presenter. Pathos, that passion, that connection, and logos, those facts and statistics you provide. Your targeted audience is your classmates, teachers, parents, administrators, community members in Whitefish Bay. It's important to remember that um, these are also people who live in the Milwaukee area. So the more you can kind of bring it back to how is it going to affect them, it's going to make you more likely to be able to persuade them. Okay. So I'd like you to watch me as I model my thinking about how I can use the rhetorical triangle to ensure that I've captured enough information, the right information to connect to my targeted audience. So what I did was I went through a couple of rows of my problem and solution chart, and I used blue highlight to identify examples of logos and yellow to identify examples of pathos. You are going to be responsible for doing this too. You're going to be responsible for finding at least one example of logos and one of pathos in your problem chart, at least one example of logos and one example of pathos in your solution chart. So again, blue is logos, yellow is pathos. So let's take a look at the logos first. When I see a fact or I see a statistic, I see a percentage, I see a number or a number word, that is my cue that I have found logos here. Okay. So I definitely have quite a few of those right here in my first example. And those I think are really going to connect with my audience. Remember, I have an audience who values education and who are lucky enough to be part of an amazing school district. So when I start to see these numbers about the homeless children in the United States, that is not only logos, it's facts, it's statistics. It's also going to move my audience because they are people who care about education. They're people who want to pay it forward and want to help other people. Down here, I also have another example of logos, this idea that there are two subpopulations of children who face like increased challenges, and those are homeless preschoolers and unaccompanied homeless youth, meaning people under the age of 18 who are homeless without living with a mature adult. So they're homeless, maybe in a lot of cases, they're runaways. um, so those are two examples that I found just in these two rows of logos of places where I'm giving some very kind of definite facts and statistics that support my issue. Then I found an example of pathos too, of that emotion here, where my chart says um, that homeless preschoolers face difficulty accessing public education. I think what happens is maybe parents and guardians feel like because they're so young, they don't need that formalized education. And so maybe they kind of like Andrew in Fly Away Home, they kind of defer that decision yet about enrolling students in school. And I think my audience would be swayed by that because my audience obviously places a high value on education. And so that idea that at this really critical age where kids should be learning to follow directions, to share, to play nicely, to speak kindly, that they're not able to access education, I think would really connect emotionally with my audience. So I definitely have at least one example of pathos and one example of ethos, or excuse me, of logos in my problem chart. Moving down to my solution chart. Here I have an example of logos, facts, statistics, where it talks about the Milwaukee chapter of the National Coalition for the Homeless, House of Peace, the Milwaukee Rescue Mission. Those are facts and statistics, and notice that I'm bringing it closer to home. I'm not just focused on the world around me, I'm bringing it home to Milwaukee, where my audience lives. I have another example of pathos here too. This idea that school children, teachers, parents can donate gently used or new school supplies and give them to shelters, give them to local organizations. Um, Thinking about the fact that we're very lucky. most of us have everything we need and a lot of what we want. And knowing that when we open up those lockers at the end of the school year and they're filled with notebooks and folders and pens and pencils and markers and highlighters that you either didn't touch or barely touched, um, that happens to a lot of us. We see that happen at the end of every school year. And so I think that's going to connect emotionally with our audience too, and make our audience think, maybe I can do better about donating some of those school supplies. So that's what you're going to be looking for in your own problem and solution charts. At least one example of logos and one example of pathos in your problem, one example of logos, one example of pathos in your solution chart.